you've heard a pastor or a Bible teacher say, now in the original Greek, the Bible says this, or in the original Hebrew, the Bible says that. Now, what does that mean? And was the Bible written in other languages? And how did it come down to us the way it came down to us? Well, I'm going to simplify the whole issue so that I leave no one behind here. I'd like everyone to be able to understand what the original languages of the Bible were and how the Bible came to be in its most basic form. I think a lot of experts tend to confuse people with extra details that really don't matter as much. So I'm going to stick to the basics. I'm going to be simplifying a little bit at the cost of some accuracy, I suppose, but I just hope you'll bear with me on that because I want people to understand the basics of where the Bible came from and which languages it came from. Now, in its most basic form, I want to talk about the word manuscript. The Bible was originally written in handwriting and lots of different parts, which became a library known as the Bible by lots of different authors over hundreds of years. But when the Bible was originally penned, it was penned on a manuscript, in manuscript form. In other words, fancy word for handwriting. The printing press didn't come along for a long, long time. Late Middle Ages, early modern period, the printing press kicked in and that changed everything. But before that, we had manuscripts. And there's lots of ancient manuscripts of what became the Bible floating around in museums and universities all over the world. So basically, I'm going to get real basic here. The Old Testament was written in manuscript form in lots of different parts, lots of different authors, in the Hebrew language. Now, the Hebrew language was a Semitic language. Semitic languages are very, very different from the languages which most of us speak, which are called Indo-European languages. Indo-European languages are heavily dependent on past, present, and future tenses, and a certain way of thinking, a certain logic to it, a certain language game. Well, the Semitic language game is different. It goes from right to left, not left to right. It has entirely different sense of what tenses are. It has what's called stems and doesn't really have a timeline in the sense that we think of past, present, and future. Also, the vowels tend to be missing in the handwriting. So it's a big challenge to read Hebrew or Arabic or Aramaic or any Semitic language for people who grew up speaking in Indo-European language. Not that it's not possible. I've learned how to read it myself and love doing so, but it's hard. Greek, on the other hand, is the language that the New Testament manuscripts were written in. And Greek is much easier to learn for people with an Indo-European background because Greek is an Indo-European language. It has a sense of past, present, and future. And words like therapeuo mean to heal. So there's a lot of words that sound very similar, kind of like Spanish and English. And it's much easier in some ways to read Greek than it is to read Hebrew. So basically, the New Testament was written in Greek and the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. There are some exceptions to that, and we'll get into that in a moment. Here's the problem. The oldest manuscripts we have of the Old Testament are only about 1,000 years old, about 1 millennium old. Now, in the grand scheme of things, that's not very old. We'd like to have manuscripts from a closer time to when the original manuscripts were written, but we have literally hundreds and hundreds of years between the time the original manuscripts were written, for let's say Isaiah or Exodus, and the oldest copy we have is from 1000 AD. So we're missing all of those ancient manuscripts. The New Testament is different. We have a lot of manuscripts from very close to the time of Jesus himself in Greek. And those manuscripts are numbered in the thousands and tens of thousands. So we have lots of really good, reliable Greek manuscripts for the New Testament. The Old Testament is a different story. In fact, one of our most reliable copies of the Old Testament isn't even in Hebrew, it's in Greek. Now that might surprise you. Hebrew was the language of the Israelite people. Greek, of course, was not. But Alexander the Great, in the 330 or so era, BC, pretty much conquered the whole known world and Hellenized it. And Hellas is the Greek word for Greece. and the whole world that he knew got Hellenized. In other words, Greek became sort of the main lingo. And it won't surprise you that there was a city named after Alexander the Great called Alexandria in modern-day Egypt. And this was an intellectual center, and it was a Greek-speaking city. Now, Alexandria was a place also where a lot of Jews lived. It's arguable that perhaps more Jews lived in Alexandria than lived in Jerusalem at the time. Now, this was 330s or so BC when Alexander conquered most of the world, and by the 200s BC, the Jews who were living in Alexandria who spoke Greek wanted the Bible to be put in their language. So it was put in their language, and this Bible is called the Septuagint, and it's basically abbreviated LXX, and Septuagint is Latin for 70, and LXX is Latin numerals for 70, because there were supposedly 70 translators who put together the Septuagint. Now, then we have a Greek copy of the Hebrew originals. And here's the problem. Our Greek copies are actually older than our Hebrew copies. Now, in case that puts your mind on just freeze up, the Hebrew was written originally, translated into Greek. More of the old Hebrew were destroyed than the Greek manuscripts. And so, therefore, the oldest manuscripts we have of the Old Testament are not in Hebrew, but they're in Greek, of all things. And so we've got a real complex situation. So when we translate the Bible, and I'm helping on a translation right now for the book of Zechariah, we read the Hebrew, but we also correct it with the Greek. We look at the Greek to kind of help bring out those things that are hard. It's hard to know what words meant, certain plants, certain animals, those kinds of things, because we have very little written in Hebrew outside of the Bible, so there's very little with which to compare it. So it's very challenging, and the Septuagint is very helpful in helping us understand the original meaning of the authors of the Old Testament. So far, that's the Old Testament. And then we have the New Testament, which is even more complicated, if you can believe that. So the New Testament, most of the people in the time of Jesus, Jesus and his teaching, probably had some knowledge of Greek and had some knowledge of Hebrew, which was spoken in the synagogues. But the going language at the dinner table at home for most people in Jesus' time in Israel was Aramaic. And Aramaic is a Semitic language much like Hebrew. Why Aramaic? Because Aramaic-speaking people had conquered Jerusalem and Israel back in the day, and the kids grew up speaking Aramaic. And so Jesus grew up speaking Aramaic, as did most of the people that he talked to. And you see little pieces of Aramaic popping out in the New Testament. So we've got people speaking Aramaic, and when the missionaries first started to move the Christian movement forward, they wrote down Jesus' teaching, not in Aramaic, but in Greek. And in writing it in Greek, the reason they did that was because the Gospels were missionary tracts. They were something a missionary would put in his or her hip pocket, so to speak, and have the stories of Jesus, especially for those who were too young to have known Jesus or actually heard him teach. And so the Gospels were written in Greek in order to get a broader audience, much like the pop group ABBA, who were Swedish, sang in English. And they didn't try to get everyone to understand their songs in Swedish. No, they published them in English because the whole point was to get the music out. And it's the same thing with the Gospels. They wanted to get the word out. The Gospels were missionary documents, as is the book of Acts. So basically you have a whole bunch of people speaking in Aramaic, Jesus teaching in Aramaic, and the people operating in Aramaic, but it being recorded in Greek. Now this is really problematic. And half of the New Testament, Luke and Acts, and all of the letters of Paul were most likely written in Greek. And these were Greek-speaking people. Luke and Paul, their first language was Greek, as opposed to some of the other stuff that happened in the New Testament. There's very little Aramaic stuff in there, although both Paul and Luke were influenced by the Aramaic teaching of Jesus and also by the Aramaic thought world and the Semitic thought world. The Bible comes out of a Semitic mindset, not an Indo-European mindset. And Paul was certainly bilingual and bicultural. In that sense, he could understand Indo-European thinking, and he could understand Semitic thinking. So we've got a really complicated situation with the New Testament. And then we have what's called the Peshitta, which is the Aramaic version of the New Testament. Now, the Peshitta was, for what we can tell from the manuscripts, followed rather quickly after the Greek. And some people think that the Aramaic was written first. That's probably not true. We don't know for sure. We don't have any proof of any of this stuff. But the chances are that the Greek books of the New Testament were penned first in manuscript form, quickly translated into Aramaic. So we have Jesus speaking Aramaic, being recorded in Greek, and then being translated back into Aramaic by people who perhaps knew or didn't know the exact words that Jesus used, but it's probably quite close. So when we read the New Testament, we read the original manuscripts in Greek, and we check it with the Aramaic, because that's actually the language that Jesus used in his ministry, which is really kind of important. And his worldview was very, very Semitic. So when we look at the Old Testament, we read the original Hebrew, and we check it with the Greek, the Septuagint. And when we read the New Testament, we read the original Greek, and we check it with the Peshitta, the Aramaic Peshitta. And that way we get a nuanced look. It's kind of like having stereo, or two lights shining on something to give it a better perspective, better depth. And so the Bible, what we have here with the Old Testament and the New Testament, is generations of very scientific and thoroughgoing research as to which of the manuscripts are the oldest, which of the manuscripts are the most accurate, and then checking them against that partner language that each one of them has. The Greek has the Aramaic to check it with, and the Hebrew has the Septuagint to check it with. So the original languages of the Bible, basically, and there's exceptions to this, there's some Aramaic in the New Testament in the original version of the Greek, and there's some Aramaic in the book of Daniel and some other places too. But the main thing we're talking about here is that the Old Testament was written in the language of the people of Israel, which was Hebrew, and we don't have a lot of older manuscripts. However, the Dead Sea Scrolls are fragments of the Old Testament in Hebrew. So we can actually check those against the Hebrew manuscripts, which we have from about 1000 AD, and also against the Septuagint. And there's a lot of accuracy in there. So what you have in your hands is one of the best possible, in English, translations from the Bible, because scholars have been looking at this stuff for generations now, studying all the manuscripts, comparing them, and trying to put the very best and most accurate version forward that is possible. So there you have it, the original languages of the Bible. Basically speaking, we have Hebrew, we have Aramaic, which is also a Semitic language, and we have Greek, which is an Indo-European language. So there you have it. If you have questions, please put those in the comments. I'll try to answer them as best I can. I apologize for not going into detail, but I didn't want to lose anybody. I wanted people to be able to follow along and have confidence in what they're reading when they read the Bible. That's the good news for today. I'll talk to you again tomorrow.